The dust motes in room 4B were performing a slow, melancholic waltz in a shaft of Tuesday afternoon sunlight, and frankly, they were having a much more productive day than Barnaby Finch. Barnaby, known to his few friends as Barney and to his teachers as that boy who needs to focus, sat in his usual spot at the very back of the classroom. It was a strategic position. From here, he could observe the back of Mr. Henderson's balding head, which resembled a very stressed-out ostrich egg, and the way Clementine Thorne's ponytail swished like a metronome whenever she took notes. Mr. Henderson was currently droning on about the socio-economic impact of the Corn Laws in the 19th century. Barney was fairly certain that if he tried to internalize one more date, his brain would simply leak out of his ears and form a puddle of historical data on the linoleum floor. "I reckon," Barney whispered, leaning sideways until his chair groaned in protest, "that the Corn Laws were just a conspiracy by Big Flower to make everyone miserable. It's a bread-based tragedy, Clemmie." Clementine didn't turn around, but her shoulders gave a microscopic shimmy of suppressed laughter. She reached back, blindly handing him a folded piece of paper. It was torn from the corner of a high-quality, lined notebook. Clemmie never used the cheap stuff. "Focus, Barnaby," the note read in her neat, upright script. "The mocks are in 3 weeks. If you fail history, your mum will actually sell your guitar on eBay. Also, you have a bit of pen ink on your chin." Barney rubbed his chin, smearing the ink further, and sighed. He looked out of the window. Beyond the grey stone walls of St. Jude's Academy, the rolling hills of the Cotswolds were turning a lush, defiant green. There was a whole world out there involving sheep, wind, and possibly some very nice sandwiches, and here he was, trapped in a room that smelled faintly of damp coats and desperation. He felt a sudden, profound sense of fake philosophy wash over him. "Why do we study the past?" he thought, staring intensely at a spider crawling up the radiator, "when the past is already over? It's like trying to eat the crumbs of a cake someone else finished 200 years ago. We should be studying the future. We should have Intro to Tomorrow, or Advanced Daydreaming." The bell finally rang with the jarring, metallic clang that Barney considered the most beautiful sound in the English language. It was the sound of freedom, or at least the sound of a 40-minute reprieve before the next ordeal. As the classroom emptied in a flurry of shuffling feet and zipping bags, Clemmie lingered by his desk. She was wearing her school blazer with a precision that Barney found both intimidating and adorable. Her tie was perfectly knotted. His looked like it had been tied by a panicked squirrel. "The usual spot?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with that particular brand of mischief she saved only for him. "The usual spot," Barney agreed, grabbing his battered rucksack. "I have a new theory about the canteen's shepherd's pie that I need to share with you. It involves extraterrestrial biological matter." They navigated the crowded corridors, dodging Year 7s who moved in erratic, high-speed clusters like schools of confused fish. They slipped past the main gates, avoided the gaze of the prowling prefects near the bike sheds, and made their way to the very back of the school grounds. Behind the old gymnasium, there was a patch of forgotten territory. It was a small, overgrown triangle of land bordered by a rusted chain-link fence and a row of ancient, gnarled oak trees. The school's Wi-Fi died exactly 3 feet before the grass started, which meant it was the only place on campus where the digital world couldn't find them. It was their sanctuary, a place where the grass was long, the buttercups were plentiful, and the pressure to be someone with a bright future felt like a distant, slightly ridiculous rumor. Barney flopped down onto the grass, ignoring the dampness that would inevitably seep into his trousers. Clemmie sat more delicately, tucking her skirt under her knees. "So," she said, looking at the sky. "Shepherd's pie. Go on then." "Right," Barney said, gesturing vaguely at the clouds. "Think about the texture. It's too consistent. No natural potato behaves like that. I believe the catering staff are actually harvesting stardust and mixing it with instant mash to keep us subdued. It's the only explanation for why everyone falls asleep in double physics. Clemmie laughed, a bright, clear sound that made Barney feel, for a moment, like he'd actually said something profound. You're an idiot, Barnaby Finch. A total, lovable idiot. I prefer the term unconventional thinker, he corrected. He lay back, resting his head on his bag. I was thinking in history about the corn laws. And then I thought about how we're all just like corn. We're planted in these rows, desks, you know, and we're expected to grow at the same rate, and then eventually, we get harvested by the exam board. That's actually quite dark for a Tuesday, Clemmie said, her smile fading slightly. She started picking at a daisy. But I get it. Sometimes I feel like if I don't get 7 A stars, I'll just vanish. Like I won't have a shape anymore. Barney looked at her. Clemmie Thorne was the smartest person he knew, but she carried her ambition like a heavy rucksack she was afraid to put down. You wouldn't vanish, he said softly. You'd just be Clemmie without the A stars. Which, in my professional opinion, is a much higher quality version of Clemmie. Less stressed. More prone to eating illegal biscuits behind the gym. She looked down at him, her expression softening. You make it sound so easy. To just not care. Oh, I care, Barney said, sat up, his face becoming uncharacteristically serious. I care about the way the light hits the trees at 4 o'clock. I care about the fact that we found this spot. I just don't care about the things that make me feel like a failure for being human. Failing a test is just a mistake, Clemmie. And mistakes are just the universe's way of saying, hey. Try a different door, this one's locked. He reached into his bag and pulled out a slightly squashed packet of jammy Dodgers. He held one out like a peace offering. Be a mistake with me. Let's eat these and pretend the Victorian era never happened. Clemmie took the biscuit, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. To being mistakes, she toasted. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the distant thud of a football on the pitch and the rustle of the oak leaves. It was that golden hour of the school day where the urgency of the morning had faded, but the homework of the evening hadn't yet taken hold. Barney? Clemmie asked after a moment. Yeah. What do you actually want to do? You know, after. When we're out of the cornfield. Barney chewed thoughtfully. I want to find a job where I can wear comfortable socks. And maybe write songs that make people feel like they're sitting in the sun. Even if they are on a rainy bus in Birmingham. I want to be the guy who reminds people that it's okay to be a bit rubbish at things as long as you're enjoying the view. He looked at her, his eyes bright with a sudden, genuine spark. What about you? And don't say cardiologist, because your dad wants you to. What does Clemmie want? Clemmie stayed quiet for a long time. She traced the pattern of the fence with her finger. I want to travel, she whispered, as if the admission were a secret too heavy for the open air. I want to go to places where nobody knows my predicted grades. I want to see the northern lights and maybe learn how to paint. I'm terrible at painting, Barney. I can't even draw a straight line. That's the spirit. Barney cheered. Be a terrible painter. Paint the worst northern lights the world has ever seen. I'll write a song about how bad they are, and we'll be famous for being spectacularly mediocre. Clemmie giggled, the tension in her shoulders finally dissolving. We'd be the most optimistic failures in England. Precisely, Barney said. He stood up, brushing the grass from his trousers. The thing is, Clemmie, everyone's so worried about being the best. But the best is just a lonely mountain peak with no one to talk to. I'd much rather be down here in the valley with the weird trees and the jammy dodgers. There's more oxygen down here. He held out a hand to help her up. As she took it, the air between them seemed to shift, becoming thick with the things they hadn't said, the way he looked for her in every crowded hall, the way she kept his silly notes in a showbox under her bed. There were words hovering behind the schoolyard, unspoken but understood, like the scent of rain before a storm. We should probably get back, Clemmie said, though she didn't let go of his hand immediately. Mrs. Gable will be patrolling the car park soon. Right? Duty calls. The corn needs to return to its row, Barney sighed, though he didn't look particularly upset. As they walked back towards the looming grey buildings, Barney stopped for a second, looking back at their secret patch of grass. You know, he said, even if I fail every single GCSE, I'll still reckon this was a successful day. Because I convinced a future world-class traveler to become a terrible painter. Clemmie smiled, a real, wide smile that reached her eyes. And I convinced a professional daydreamer to eat his chin ink. They entered the school again, the smell of floor polish rushing back to meet them. But as they parted ways to head to their respective buses, Barney felt a strange, buoyant energy. He felt like he could handle the corn laws, the trigonometry, and even the questionable shepherd's pie. He climbed onto the back of the number 42 bus, found a seat by the window, and pulled out a crumpled notebook. He didn't write down dates or formulas. Instead, he wrote, "The stars are made of potato mash, and the future is a door that hasn't been built yet. Don't forget to bring better socks." He watched Clemmie through the glass as she boarded her own bus, her ponytail swishing, her posture just a little less rigid than it had been 2 hours ago. He waved, and she waved back, a small, private signal across the tarmac. Barney leaned his head against the vibrating window. He knew that tomorrow there would be more tests, more pressure, and more lectures about reaching one's potential. But he also knew that behind the gymnasium, the buttercups were still growing, the Wi-Fi was still dead, and he had a friend who was willing to be a magnificent mistake right alongside him. And in the grand, confusing scheme of the universe, Barney Finch decided that was more than enough to be going on with. He closed his eyes, tuned out the shouting of the year 9s at the front of the bus, and began to hum a melody that sounded exactly like a Tuesday afternoon in the sun. It wasn't a perfect melody. It was a bit flat in places and the rhythm was slightly off, but it was his. And as far as Barney was concerned, that made it a masterpiece. The bus lurched forward, pulling away from St. Jude's and out into the winding lanes of the countryside. Barney didn't look back at the school. He looked forward, towards the hills, towards the mistakes he hadn't made yet, and towards the many, many jammy dodgers still left to be eaten in the hidden corners of the world. He realized then, with the sudden clarity of a fake philosopher, that life wasn't about the grades you got, or the career you built. It was about the people who stayed with you behind the schoolyard, when the rest of the world was busy being important. It was about the unspoken words that didn't need to be said, because they were already written in the grass and the sky and the shared silence of a perfect, messy, beautiful afternoon. Yeah, Barney whispered to his own reflection in the darkened glass. Everything's going to be absolutely, brilliantly rubbish. And I can't wait. The bus ride home was always a symphony of rattling metal and the smell of damp woolen blazers. A uniquely British olfactory experience that Barney Finch had come to associate with the slow death of his intellectual ambition. Outside the window, the Oxfordshire countryside rolled by in shades of bruised purple and muddy green. The hedges were overgrown, looking like uncombed hair against the twilight sky. Barney sat there, his head bumping rhythmically against the glass, feeling less like a student and more like a soggy digestive biscuit that had been left in the tea far too long. He was falling apart, but in a way that felt strangely comfortable. He looked down at his crumpled notebook. The line about the potato mash stars stared back at him. It was nonsense, pure and simple, the kind of drivel that would make his English teacher, Mr. Sterling, weep into his tweed elbow patches. But to Barney, it was the most honest thing he'd written all year. It was a manifesto of the mediocre, a declaration of independence from the tyranny of the marking scheme. When the bus finally wheezed to a halt at the end of his lane, Barney hopped off, his rucksack swinging heavily against his spine. The air in the village of Little Whittington was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and the promise of rain that never quite arrived. He walked past the local shop, where the closed sign was already dangling crookedly, and made his way to the Finch residence, a semi-detached house, with a front garden that was currently losing a war against groundsel and rogue dandelions. "Is that you, Barnaby?" his mother called out from the kitchen as the front door groaned shut. Only his mother called him Barnaby. It was a name for a boy who owned a pony, or understood the nuances of the footsie 100. Barney was neither of those things. "No, it's a ghost sent to warn you about the perils of overboiling the sprouts," Barney replied, dropping his bag in the hallway with a thud that vibrated through the floorboards. He walked into the kitchen to find his mother, Sarah, staring intently at a stack of revision timetables she'd printed out for him. She was a woman who believed that color coding was the primary solution to most of life's existential crises. If you highlighted Mughal Empire in neon yellow, it surely couldn't hurt you. "I've moved your biology to Tuesday evening," she said, her eyes scanning the grid like a general planning a siege. "And I think if we cut down on your staring out of the window time by 20%, we can fit in an extra hour of algebra." Barney leaned against the door frame, watching her. He loved his mother, but he often felt they were speaking two different languages. She spoke in results and career paths. He spoke in cloud formations and the mystery of why we have 5 toes. "Mum," he said softly, "have you ever considered that staring out of the window is actually a highly specialized form of mental processing? I'm not just looking at the birds. I'm empathizing with them. I'm wondering if the pigeons are also worried about their midterm assessments." Sarah sighed, finally looking up. Her face softened, but the worry remained etched in the corners of her mouth. "Barney, I just want you to have options. The world is a big, scary place if you don't have the right pieces of paper." "I have pieces of paper," Barney countered, grinning. "I have a very impressive collection of receipts from the tuck shop. And Clemmie and I started a painting today. It's mostly abstract. And mostly on my chin." "Clemmie Thorne." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. The Thornes were the village's golden family. Clemmie's father was a high-flying barrister, and her mother ran a boutique PR firm that seemed to consist entirely of drinking expensive coffee and looking busy. "How is she?" "I heard she's predicted straight A stars." Barney felt a pang of something sharp in his chest, a mixture of protectiveness and annoyance. "She's fine. She's very good at being what everyone wants her to be. But I think she's actually more interested in being a terrible artist." He retreated upstairs before the conversation could veer back into the realm of potential. His bedroom was what his father called a health hazard, and what Barney called the Museum of Unfinished Ideas. There were half-built Lego sets, a guitar with 3 strings, and stacks of second-hand books with broken spines. He threw himself onto his bed and stared at the ceiling, where a small patch of damp was slowly taking the shape of South America. Across the village, in a house that was significantly more organized and smelled faintly of lavender and expensive candles, Clementine Thorne was sitting at a mahogany desk that felt like a prison. Her room was a temple to academic excellence. There were no posters of bands or movies. Instead, the walls were covered in periodic tables, French verbs, and a meticulously drawn map of the Western Front. She opened her rucksack and pulled out her history textbook, but her hand lingered on the small, battered showbox hidden behind her encyclopedias. She pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of scraps of paper, napkins, torn edges of exercise books, and even a flattened crisp packet. Every single one had Barney Finch's handwriting on it. The weather today is mildly disappointed. If you were a vegetable, you'd be a carrot, because you're good for the eyes, but slightly too orange. Don't panic about the physics test. Gravity is just a suggestion. Clemmie ran her finger over the ink. Barney was the only person who didn't look at her and see a future doctor or a university scholarship. He just saw Clemmie. He saw the girl who sometimes wanted to scream during assembly, the girl who secretly hated the violin, the girl who felt like she was carrying the weight of the entire Thorne family legacy in her school blazer pocket. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from her father. How's the revision for the corn laws going? Remember, the mock exam is tomorrow. Precision is key, Clementine. Don't let the details slip. She felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She looked at the textbook, The Repeal of the Corn Laws, 1846. It felt so heavy, so desperately unimportant compared to the way the sun had hit the grass behind the gym that afternoon. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the smell of the jammy Dodgers. She tried to remember Barney's ridiculous chin ink and the way he'd talked about the oxygen in the valley. Precision, she whispered to herself. Right? She picked up her pen, but instead of writing about Sir Robert Peel, she drew a tiny, barely visible sketch of a buttercup in the margin of her notes. It was a small rebellion, a tiny crack in the porcelain of her perfection. The next morning at St. Jude's was what Barney liked to call the Great Grey. A thick mist had rolled in from the Thames, swallowing the playing fields and making the Victorian brickwork of the main building look like a Gothic asylum. Students huddled in the corridors, their faces pale in the flickering fluorescent light, clutching their revision guides like holy relics. The atmosphere was thick with the collective dread of the Year 11 history mock. Barney was leaning against his locker, trying to convince a Year 7 student that the school was actually built on an ancient Viking burial ground, and that the bells only rang to soothe the restless spirits. He stopped when he saw Clemmie walking down the hall. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair, usually tied in a perfect, sleek ponytail, had a few stray strands escaping. But when she saw him, her face transformed. It was like a light being switched on in a dark room. You look like you've been fighting a war, Barney said as she reached him. I have, she replied, her voice low. The war of the 1840s. I think the Corn Laws won. Never let the corn win, Clemmie. It's a grain. It has no brain. You have a brain. Therefore, you are the superior organism. She laughed, a short, breathless sound. I didn't sleep, Barney. I kept seeing dates dancing on the ceiling. 1815, 1828, 1846. They are just numbers, but they feel like bars on a cage. Barney reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, slightly squashed object wrapped in a napkin. Here. The ultimate antidote to historical trauma. She unwrapped it. It was a single, slightly mangled custard cream. I saved it from breakfast, he said proudly. It represents hope. And also a significant amount of sugar. Thank you, she said, actually looking like she might cry for a second. She took a bite, and for a moment, the grey halls of St. Jude's didn't seem quite so oppressive. Listen, Barney whispered, leaning in closer. When we get into that hall, don't look at the clock. The clock is a liar. It's just a circle with sticks. Just think about the valley. Think about the weird trees. I'll be at the back, probably trying to see how many pens I can balance on my nose. If you feel like you're drowning in corn, just look back. I'll give you the all-clear signal. What's the all-clear signal? Barney thought for a second, then performed a subtle, incredibly dorky wiggle of his eyebrows. That's it. It means, the universe is vast, we are small, and none of this actually matters in the grand scheme of the Andromeda Galaxy. Right, Clemmie smiled, her shoulders dropping an inch. Andromeda. Got it. The bell rang, a harsh, metallic clang that signaled the start of the exam. The double doors to the great hall were swung open by Mr. Henderson, the senior invigilator. Mr. Henderson was a man who seemed to have been carved out of a very old, very grumpy oak tree. He wore a black gown that smelled of mothballs and authority. Enter in silence, he barked. Leave your bags at the perimeter. Find your candidate numbers. The future starts now. The future starts now, Barney thought as he shuffled into the hall. What a terrifying thought. Why can't the future start in, say, 3 weeks? Or after lunch? The hall was a cavernous space with a high, vaulted ceiling. Rows upon rows of individual wooden desks were laid out with mathematical precision. On each desk was a single sheet of A4 paper and a black ballpoint pen. It looked like a graveyard for creativity. Barney found his desk at the very back, his natural habitat. From here, he could see the entire ecosystem of the year group. There was anxious Andy in the front row, already sweating through his shirt. There was cool Chloe, who looked like she was about to fall asleep. And there, 3 rows ahead and slightly to the left, was Clemmie. She sat rigidly, her back a straight line of tension. She looked like she was bracing for an impact. You may begin, Mr. Henderson announced, clicking his stopwatch with a sound that felt like a gunshot. The sound of 300 pens hitting paper, at once was like the rustle of dry leaves in a forest. Barney opened his paper. Question 1. Explain the impact of the 1815 Corn Laws on the British working class. He stared at the words. He knew the answer. He'd read the textbook. He knew about the rising bread prices, the unrest, the Peterloo massacre. But as he looked at the blank lines, he found himself thinking about the baker who had to bake the bread. He wondered if the baker had a dog. He wondered if the dog liked the crusts. He looked up. The sun was trying to poke through the high, arched windows, casting long, dusty beams across the hall. In the light, he could see millions of dust motes dancing. He realized that each of those dust motes was probably more complex than the entire economic policy of the 19th century. He looked at Clemmie. She was writing furiously, her hand moving in a blurred arc. But then, she stopped. Her pen hovered. Her head bowed. He could see her hand trembling. The pressure was hitting her. The Thorne legacy was sitting on her shoulders, whispering that if she didn't remember the exact date of the Importation Act, she was a failure. Barney didn't think. He didn't care about Mr. Henderson's hawk-like gaze, or the threat of instant disqualification. He dropped his pen on purpose. It made a loud clatter on the wooden floor. Several heads turned. Mr. Henderson narrowed his eyes. Clemmie looked back. Barney was leaning back in his chair, a look of extreme, exaggerated calm on his face. And then, he did it. The wiggle. The dorky, rhythmic movement of his eyebrows that said, "It's just paper, Clemmie. It's just corn." She stared at him for a heartbeat. Then, her lips twitched. A tiny, secret smile broke across her face. She took a deep breath, a real, lung-filling breath, and turned back to her paper. She started writing again, but the frantic energy was gone. It was replaced by a steady, rhythmic pace. Barney picked up his pen. He decided that if he was going to fail, he was going to fail with style. He wrote, "The Corn Laws were a bit of a mess, really. Everyone wanted bread, but the government wanted money. It's a classic tale of humans being slightly rubbish at sharing. He continued in that vein for the next 2 hours. He answered the questions, but he did it with the voice of a man who was narrating a nature documentary about a particularly confused species. He wrote about the dramatic eyebrows of the Whig Party and the existential crisis of the Tory landowners. As they filed out, the air outside felt incredibly sweet. The mist had cleared, leaving the world bright and sharp. Barney. Clemmie caught up to him by the bike sheds. She was glowing. The exhaustion was still there, but it was buried under a layer of genuine relief. The eyebrows. They saved me. They have a power of their own, Barney said, modestly. I'm thinking of insuring them. Like a famous footballer's legs. I actually wrote it, she said, her voice full of wonder. I didn't just recite the textbook. I actually thought about what it meant. I think I might have even been a bit opinionated. Disaster, Barney joked. Next thing you know, you'll be having your own thoughts about everything. You'll be uncontrollable. A rogue scholar. I think I'd like that, she said softly. They walked towards the bus stop, the silence between them no longer heavy, but light and airy. So, Clemmie said, what's the plan for the terrible painting? Now that the corn has been defeated. Barney looked at the sky, where the clouds were starting to turn a pale, dusty pink. Well, I was thinking we could tackle the insignificant nature of trigonometry on Thursday. But for now, I think we should focus on the immediate future. And what does the immediate future hold? Barney reached into his bag and pulled out a slightly crumpled paper bag he'd liberated from the local shop that morning. A celebratory packet of Monster Munch. Pickled onion flavor. The breakfast of champions. Clemmie laughed, and this time, it wasn't a short sound. It was a long, bright melody that seemed to echo off the grey walls of St. Jude's, making them look, just for a moment, like they were made of nothing more than cardboard. You're ridiculous, Barney Finch, she said, reaching into the bag. I know, he replied, popping a giant maize claw into his mouth. And isn't it wonderful? As they sat on the low stone wall of the car park, two teenagers eating neon orange snacks in the fading light, Barney realized his fake philosophy was actually quite true. The world didn't need more perfect painters or brilliant historians. It needed people who knew when to drop their pens. It needed people who understood that a shared pickled onion snack was worth more than a dozen A-stars. He looked at Clemmie, who was currently trying to explain why the shape of a monster munch was geometrically fascinating, and he knew that they were going to be just fine. They were the architects of their own beautiful, magnificent failures, and the view from the valley was better than any mountain peak in the world. The bus arrived, its headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Barney stood up and offered his hand to Clemmie, just like he had in the grass. This time, when she took it, she didn't let go until they reached the doors. See you tomorrow, rogue scholar, he said. See you tomorrow, Barney, she replied. As the bus pulled away, Barney looked at his reflection in the window. He didn't see a boy who was failing his mocks. He saw a boy who was winning at being himself. And as far as he was concerned, that was the only grade that mattered. The road ahead was winding and full of potholes, but Barney Finch just leaned back, hummed his slightly out-of-tune melody, and waited for the next brilliantly rubbish thing to happen. After all, the stars were still made of potato mash, and he still had plenty of snacks left to share. The morning after the Great Corn Law Rebellion, as Barney had already begun calling it in his head, the corridors of St. Jude's felt different. Usually, the air in the hallways was thick with the scent of floor wax, damp blazers, and the collective anxiety of 800 teenagers trying to remember if the mitochondria was the powerhouse of the cell, or just a very small, very lost Italian pasta shape. But today, for Barney, the air felt like it had been filtered through a particularly expensive silk screen. He arrived at his locker to find a small, folded piece of notebook paper wedged into the slats. He opened it with the careful precision of a bomb disposal expert. Inside, in Clemmie's neat, slightly too perfect to be human handwriting, were 3 words. Eyebrows 1, Tories 0. Barney grinned, a wide, lopsided thing that made a passing Year 7 look at him with genuine concern. He shoved the note into his pocket and headed for double mathematics. Mathematics was held in room 42, a place where joy went to be dismantled into its constituent equations and then discarded in a recycling bin. Mr. Thorne, a man who looked like he had been constructed entirely out of right angles and bitter memories, was already at the whiteboard. He was drawing a circle with a compass that looked like it could be used as a medieval weapon. Barney took his usual seat at the back, the prime real estate for those who preferred to observe the universe rather than participate in its quantification. Clemmie was already there, 3 rows ahead, her back straight, her highlighter pens arranged like a colorful picket line on her desk. But as Barney sat down, she turned her head just a fraction. She didn't wave. She didn't even smile. She just gave him a tiny, imperceptible nod, like a fellow spy acknowledging a contact in a crowded railway station. "Today," Mr. Thorne announced, his voice sounding like gravel being turned in a cement mixer, "we shall be exploring the glorious intricacies of trigonometry. Specifically, the sine rule. I trust you have all completed the pre-reading. Unless you spent your evening contemplating the existential void." Barney leaned back, his chair creaking in a way that suggested it was also tired of the sine rule. He pulled out his notebook, the one meant for calculus, but mostly filled with sketches of birds wearing hats, and wrote at the top of the page, "The sine rule, a desperate attempt by humanity to make sense of the fact that triangles are, fundamentally, quite pointy." "Mr. Finch," Thorne barked, not even turning away from the board. "Since you appear to be composing a symphony on your chair, perhaps you can tell the class the formula for the area of a non-right-angled triangle using the sine." The class went silent. This was the moment where the predator pounced. Usually, Barney would stammer, turn a shade of red that would put a beetroot to shame, and eventually mutter something about being ill. But today, the spirit of the Whig eyebrows was with him. "Well, sir," Barney said, his voice remarkably steady. "One could argue that the area of a triangle is less about the formula and more about the space it occupies in our hearts. However, if we must be pedantic, I believe it's half a B sine C. Though I've always felt A and B get far too much credit while C just sits there, being an angle." A few people sniggered. Mr. Thorne froze, his compass hovering an inch from the board. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing behind thick spectacles. "A comedian," Thorne whispered. "We have a stand-up philosopher in our midst. Half a B sine C is correct, Finch. Though your commentary on the emotional labor of variables is, shall we say, surplus to requirements. Stick to the numbers. The numbers do not have hearts. That is why they are reliable." Barney caught Clemmie's eye. She was biting her lip, trying desperately not to laugh. He felt a sudden, sharp jolt of victory. It wasn't about the answer. It was about the fact that Thorne's world, the world of cold, hard reliability, had been momentarily dented by a bit of nonsense. As the lesson ground on, Barney watched the clock. The second hand moved with agonizing slowness, like a weary hiker trudging through treacle. He began to think about the nature of time. Why was a minute in a maths lesson approximately 3 times longer than a minute spent eating a biscuit? It was a fundamental flaw in the fabric of reality. He spent the next 20 minutes drawing a diagram of a time dilator, which looked suspiciously like a kettle that brewed tea so strong it slowed down the rotation of the earth. When the bell finally chimed, sounding like a choir of angels to Barney's ears, he took his time packing away. He waited until the flurry of panicked students had cleared out before wandering towards the door. Clemmie was waiting by the water fountain. The emotional labor of variables, she asked, falling into step beside him. You're going to get yourself detention, Barney. Or worse. He'll make you do the lunchtime Sudoku club. A fate worse than death, Barney agreed. But did you see his face? For 1 second, he actually considered if C was lonely. I saw it in his left pupil. He was considering how many marks he could deduct from your existence, Clemmie corrected, though her eyes were bright. I did it again, by the way. Did what? The rogue thing. During the practice questions, I didn't use the ruler for my diagrams. I free-handed the triangles. She leaned in, whispering conspiratorially. They weren't even perfectly straight. One of them looked a bit like a squashed pear. Barney gasped, clutching his chest. The anarchy. The sheer, unadulterated chaos of it. Next, you'll be telling me you used a blue pen, when the instructions clearly stated black ink only. Don't push it, she laughed. They walked out into the quad. The sun was trying its best to penetrate the English clouds, resulting in a kind of milky, lukewarm light that made the school's concrete buildings look slightly less like a high-security prison and more like a low-budget film set. I have a confession, Clemmie said, her voice dropping a register. I haven't actually looked at my revision timetable since yesterday. I went home, I sat at my desk, I looked at the color-coded blocks for chemistry, organic compounds. And I went and watched a documentary about giant squids instead. Barney stopped walking. He looked at her with genuine pride. Clemmie. That is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Giant squids are infinitely more important than alkanes and alkenes. They have 3 hearts, you know. And beaks. Why don't we have beaks? It would make eating Monster Munch much more efficient. I felt guilty for about 10 minutes, she admitted. But then I thought about what you said. About the stars being made of potato mash. And I realized that if the world ends tomorrow, I'd rather know about the bioluminescent ink of a deep-sea cephalopod than the boiling point of ethanol. Precisely. You're learning. You're unlearning, actually. Which is much harder. They sat down on a bench that was slightly damp, but neither of them cared. This was their spot now, the demilitarized zone between the pressure of the classroom and the reality of the world. So, Barney said, pulling a squashed cereal bar from his pocket and offering her half. What's the actual plan? We can't just fail everything. My mum thinks I'm going to be an architect. She's already picked out the font for my business cards. Clemmie took the half bar, inspecting the oats. I think we do the work, but we don't let the work do us. We pass, because passing is a useful ticket to get out of here. But we don't give them our souls. We keep the souls for the squids and the bad paintings. A tactical surrender, Barney mused. I like it. We give them the a squared plus b squared in exchange for our right to think that triangles are secretly judging us. Exactly. They sat in silence for a while, chewing on the dry oats. Around them, the school roared with its usual lunchtime madness. A group of Year 9s were trying to kick a football over the roof of the gym. A teacher was shouting about tucked-in shirts. A distant bell was ringing for a club that no one wanted to attend. It was a symphony of the mundane. Do you ever feel, Clemmie said softly, looking at the grey sky, like we're all just waiting for something to happen? Like we're in a waiting room, and we're all reading the same boring magazines, and we're terrified that when our name is finally called, we'll realize we're at the wrong doctor's office. Barney looked at her. Her expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of that old, sharp anxiety underneath. Every day, he said. But the trick is to realize that there is no doctor. The waiting room is the whole point. We might as well start a game of tag, or draw on the walls while we're here. She smiled, a real one this time, that reached her eyes. You're very strange, Barney Finch. I prefer the term conceptually fluid. The rest of the week passed in a blur of small rebellions. In English literature, while studying Macbeth, Barney suggested that Lady Macbeth's main problem was a lack of a good hobby, perhaps pottery, or extreme knitting. In geography, Clemmie wrote a paragraph about how Oxbow Lakes looked like the universe was trying to write the letter U, but got distracted by a butterfly. They weren't being disruptive, not exactly. They were just injecting a little bit of humanity into the rigid, cold veins of the curriculum. And the strangest thing happened, they started to enjoy it. The fear of the wrong answer began to dissolve, replaced by the joy of the interesting thought. On Thursday, they found themselves back in the art room. It was the one place where the rogue scholar energy felt most at home. The room smelled of turpentine and old dreams. Mr. Miller, the art teacher, was a man who looked like he had been put through a washing machine with a box of crayons. He wandered around, humming to himself, occasionally nodding at a canvas. Barney was standing in front of his terrible painting. He had added more potato mash stars. He had also added a small, purple cow in the corner, because why not? The universe was a big place, surely there was room for a purple cow. Clemmie was at the easel next to him. She wasn't drawing a diagram of a cell, or a map of the Industrial Revolution. She was painting. It was a mess of blues and greens, swirling together in a way that looked remarkably like the deep ocean. Is that a squid? Barney asked, peering at her canvas. Maybe, she said, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. Or maybe it's how I feel when I think about the sign rule. It's hard to tell. It's brilliant, Barney said, and he meant it. It wasn't good in the way a textbook illustration is good. It was good because it looked like it had been made by a person who was actually alive. Mr. Finch, Mr. Miller's voice drifted over from the sink. That cow. It's remarkably courageous. Thank you, sir, Barney said. I felt it needed a witness. To the potato stars. A witness. Yes. We all need one of those, don't we? Mr. Miller wandered off, still humming. Clemmie laughed. I think he's one of us, Barney. A rogue. The original rogue, Barney agreed. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, golden shadows across the paint-stained floor, Barney felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he was 6 years old and convinced he could fly if he just wore the right pair of socks. The pressure to be someone, to be a grade A student, a future architect, a success story, felt lighter. He was just Barney. He was a boy with a purple cow and a friend who painted squids. Hey, Clemmie. What if the something never happens? He asked, echoing her question from the bench. What if this, the school, the bad snacks, the purple cows, what if this is it? She paused, her brush dripping a single drop of cerulean onto the floor. She looked around the messy, chaotic room, then at Barney, then back at her painting. Then I think, she said slowly, that it's actually a pretty good it. As long as there's someone to share the monster munch with. Barney nodded. He picked up his brush and gave the purple cow a tiny, jaunty hat. The weekend loomed ahead, usually a time of intense, soul-crushing revision. But as they cleaned their brushes together at the sink, the water running cloudy with paint, they made a silent pact. There would be study, yes. There would be equations and dates and chemical formulas. But there would also be walks in the woods. There would be terrible films. There would be long conversations about nothing in particular. They were the architects of their own magnificent failures, and so far, the design was looking spectacular. As they walked out of the school gates that afternoon, the wind was picking up, tossing crisp packets and dead leaves into the air in a miniature cyclone. Barney turned his face into the breeze, feeling the sting of the cold and the warmth of the fading sun. "Same time Monday?" he asked. "Same time Monday," Clemmie replied. "Bring the pickled onion flavor. I think we need to tackle the French Revolution, and that requires serious seasoning." "You got it, rogue scholar." Barney watched her walk away, her backpack bouncing with every step. He realized then that his fake philosophy wasn't a shield against the world, it was a lens. It didn't make the problems go away, but it made them look like what they really were: small, temporary, and occasionally quite funny. He started the walk home, his mind already drifting. He wondered if the French Revolution would have been different if they'd had better snacks. The reign of Turenne, he thought. The Baguette Bastille. He chuckled to himself, a solitary boy in a navy blazer, walking through the dusk of a suburban town. He wasn't going to be the greatest architect in the world. He wasn't going to save the planet, or solve the mysteries of the universe. But as he stepped over a puddle, he saw his reflection, distorted, wobbling, and wearing a slightly lopsided grin, and he knew that, for now, that was more than enough. The stars were coming out, hidden behind the clouds, waiting to be turned into mush by the next person who dared to look up and dream of something wonderfully rubbish. And Barney Finch was more than happy to be that person. He reached his front door, took a deep breath of the damp evening air, and stepped inside. The house smelled of dinner and reality, but in his pocket, the note from Clemmie felt like a secret map to a place where the rules didn't apply. Eyebrows 1, Tories 0. He smiled. The game was only just beginning. Barnaby Finch's bedroom was a sanctuary of semi-organized chaos. A place where the laws of physics seemed to apply only sporadically, and the smell of old gym socks battled heroically against a plug-in air freshener that was supposed to smell like alpine mist, but actually smelled like industrial-strength gin. He sat at his desk, staring at a diagram of a human kidney in his biology textbook. To Barnaby, the kidney looked suspiciously like a disgruntled bean that had been forced to do its taxes. He drew a tiny pair of spectacles on it and a miniature briefcase. Now it wasn't just an organ, it was Arthur, the middle management kidney, who was just 3 years away from a comfortable pension in the lower abdomen. "Barnaby, are you actually revising? Or are you staring into the middle distance again?" His mother's voice drifted up the stairs, sharp and tinged with that specific brand of parental anxiety that suggested she could already see his future as a professional leaf unroller or a freelance cloud namer. "I'm synthesizing, Mum," Barnaby shouted back, which wasn't technically a lie. He was synthesizing a backstory for Arthur the kidney. The distal convoluted tubule is a real riot. He heard her sigh, a long, weary sound that echoed through the floorboards of their semi-detached house in Thornbury. Thornbury was a town designed by people who found the color beige too adventurous. It was a place of tidy hedges, sensible hatchbacks, and a local park where the most exciting thing that had happened in the last decade was a pigeon getting stuck in a discarded Greg's bag. Barnaby leaned back, his chair creaking in protest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled note Clemmie had given him. "Eyebrows 1, Tories 0. He traced the ink with his thumb. It was strange how a few words on a scrap of paper could feel heavier than a 300-page textbook on the socio-economic impacts of the Industrial Revolution. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Clemmie. "The library is currently occupied by a group of Year 7s who are using the encyclopedias to build a fort. Meet at the duck pond. I've acquired a packet of hobnobs. The chocolate ones." Barnaby felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of adrenaline. The hobnob was the king of biscuits, the SAS of the confectionery world. If Clemmie was bringing the chocolate ones, this wasn't just a study session, it was a summit. He grabbed his bag, stuffed Arthur the kidney inside, and performed a stealthy maneuver past his mother's craft room. He slipped out the front door, the late October air nipping at his ears. The sky was that bruised, purplish-grey color that usually preceded a proper British downpour, the kind of rain that didn't just fall, but seemed to seep into your very soul. The duck pond was situated at the edge of the Thornberry Common, a patch of grass that was mostly mud and disappointment. Clemmie was already there, perched on a bench that looked like it hadn't been painted since the late 70s. She was wearing an oversized yellow raincoat that made her look like a very stylish lemon. "You're late," she said, not looking up from a notebook. "I've already eaten too." They were magnificent. The structural integrity was flawless. The bus was delayed by a rogue tractor, Barnaby lied, sliding onto the bench beside her. He took the offered biscuit and crunched into it. So, the French Revolution. Why was everyone so cross? Clemmie closed her notebook. Because they didn't have hobnobs, Barnaby. History is essentially just a long series of people being hangry, because the aristocracy kept all the good snacks for themselves. Marie Antoinette didn't say, "Let them eat cake." She said, "Let them eat those weird, dry crackers that nobody likes." And that was the final straw. Barnaby laughed, the sound puffing out in a cloud of white mist. "You know, if you put that in your A-level paper, you'd either get an A for originality, or be banned from the education system entirely." "I'm aiming for the latter," she grinned. "It's more sustainable." They sat in silence for a while, watching a lone mallard attempt to navigate a floating crisp packet. The absurdity of it all, the exams, the pressure, the tiny town of Thornberry, felt distant. Here, by the murky water, they were the rulers of their own little kingdom of nonsense. "Do you ever feel," Barnaby started, picking at the wood of the bench, "like we're just waiting? Like life is this huge, terrifying party that we haven't been invited to yet. So we're just standing in the hallway, looking at the coats." Clemmie turned to look at him, her grey eyes thoughtful. "All the time. My sister is already at the party. She's at Bristol, doing law. She sends home photos of herself looking exhausted but fulfilled. My parents look at those photos like they're religious icons. And then they look at me and my squids. And they just blink. Like they're trying to adjust their eyes to a very dim light." "My dad wants me to be an architect," Barnaby admitted. "He thinks I have a structural mind. But every time I try to draw a building, I end up drawing a chimney that looks like a hat. I don't want to build skyscrapers, Clemmie. I want to build, I don't know, something that doesn't have to stand up to a building inspector." "A cathedral of clouds," she suggested, her voice soft. "Exactly. With a basement for the ghosts of forgotten jokes." She nudged his shoulder with hers. "We're the back of the class philosophers, Barnaby. People think we're just daydreaming, but we're actually doing the heavy lifting. We're holding up the sky with our imaginations, while everyone else is busy looking at their spreadsheets." The rain began then, not a drizzle, but a sudden, confident deluge. They didn't move. The yellow raincoat and the navy blazer took the brunt of it. "Barnaby." "Yeah. If we fail. If the something never happens, and we end up staying in Thornberry, working at the co-op, and arguing about the price of milk. Will it be okay?" Barnaby looked at her. Her hair was starting to plaster to her forehead, and there was a crumb of chocolate on her chin. In that moment, with the rain drumming against the plastic of her hood and the smell of damp earth rising around them, he felt a strange, fierce certainty. "If you're there to argue about the milk with me," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "then yeah. It'll be the best damn milk arguing anyone's ever seen." Clemmie smiled, a real, wide smile that reached her eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a marker pen. Taking Barnaby's hand, she wrote a single word across his palm in thick, black ink, "unstoppable." "Even if we're just stopping for biscuits," she added. They stood up, drenched and shivering, and began the walk back toward the town lights. The Great British Grey was still there, looming over the horizon, but it didn't look quite so heavy anymore. It looked like a canvas. As Barnaby walked Clemmie to her bus stop, he felt a peculiar lightness in his chest. The exams were still coming. Arthur the kidney was still waiting in his bag. The world was still demanding he become a version of himself he didn't recognize. But he had a word on his hand and a friend who understood the political significance of a hobnob. "See you tomorrow, Rogue," Clemmie said, stepping onto the number 42 bus. "Tomorrow," Barnaby replied. He watched the bus pull away, its red taillights blurring in the rain. He looked down at his palm. The ink was already smudging, the U and the N bleeding into each other. By the time he got home, it would probably just be a dark blur. But as he turned the corner onto his street, Barnaby Finch didn't feel like a boy failing his mocks. He felt like an architect of the invisible, a witness to the potato stars, and a man who knew exactly how to draw a hat on a kidney. The house was quiet when he let himself in. His mother was in the lounge, the flickering blue light of the television casting long shadows. He headed straight for his room, sat back down at his desk, and opened his biology book. He didn't study the distal convoluted tubule. Instead, he took a blank sheet of paper and began to draw. He drew a town that looked a bit like Thornberry, but with more color. He drew buildings that defied gravity and streets that led to places that didn't have names. And right in the middle, sitting on a bench by a pond, he drew two small figures under a very large, very bright yellow umbrella. He realized then that the something wasn't a destination. It wasn't a grade, or a job, or a house with a sensible hedge. It was the feeling of being understood in a world that spoke a different language. It was the quiet rebellion of staying hopeful when the forecast called for rain. Barnaby closed his eyes and listened to the rain tapping against his window pane. It sounded like a code. It sounded like a secret. It sounded like the beginning of a story that he was finally ready to write. The weekend wasn't over. The revision wasn't done. The future was still a terrifying, blank map. But Barnaby Finch, with his smudged palm and his ridiculous dreams, was no longer afraid of the empty spaces. He was going to fill them with purple cows, courageous squids, and enough fake philosophy to drown out the sound of the ticking clock. He picked up his pen, looked at Arthur the kidney one last time, and turned the page. The game wasn't just beginning, it was evolving. And for the first time in his 17 years, Barnaby Finch was perfectly fine with not knowing the score. The steam from the radiator in Barnaby's bedroom carried the faint, nostalgic scent of damp wool and old exercise books. He sat there in his boxers, his school trousers draped over the heater like a fallen soldier, watching the vapor rise. On his palm, the word unstoppable had migrated. The U was now a blurry bruise near his thumb, and the P had decided to colonize his lifeline. It looked less like a motivational mantra, and more like a very specific, ink-based skin condition. He didn't care. He picked up a digestive biscuit from the packet on his bedside table, the last one, the one that's mostly crumbs and disappointment, and dunked it into a mug of tea that had gone the temperature of a lukewarm bath. It collapsed instantly, a structural failure of buttery proportions. "Story of my life," Barnaby whispered to the empty room. Structural failure with a hint of wholemeal. But as he licked the soggy remains off his thumb, he felt a strange, bubbling defiance. Usually, The Sunday night dread was a heavy, leaden thing that sat on his chest and whispered about UCAS deadlines and the inevitable heat death of the universe. Tonight, the dread had been replaced by a sort of cosmic shrug. If the world was going to end in a flurry of unmarked papers and missed opportunities, he might as well enjoy the view from the edge. Monday morning arrived with the grace of a brick through a window. The sky over Thornbury was the color of a wet pavement, and the air felt like it had been recycled through a vacuum cleaner. Barnaby stood at the bus stop, his tie slightly askew, his blazer still smelling faintly of rain and the ode to despair Clemmie had recited in the park. When the 42 bus pulled up, Clemmie was already there, her yellow raincoat a violent, beautiful insult to the morning's gloom. She was leaning against the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she drew a series of small, concentric circles. "Morning, fellow traveler," she said as he slid into the seat beside her. She looked exhausted, her eyes underlined with the purple shadows of a late-night artistic epiphany, but her grin was sharp. "I've decided," she announced, without preamble. "The biology exam isn't an assessment of our knowledge of the natural world. It's a performance piece. It's a postmodern commentary on the futility of categorizing life into neat little boxes." "I told my mum something similar," Barnaby replied, adjusting his bag. "She told me if I didn't get at least a C, she was going to turn my bedroom into a craft room for her decapage." "I don't even know what decapage is, Clemmie, but it sounds like a slow death by floral cutouts." "We shall resist the decapage," Clemmie declared, pulling a crumpled bag of Haribo from her pocket. "Breakfast of champions." They shared a handful of gummy bears, the green ones, which everyone knows are the most philosophical, and watched the damp suburbs of Thornbury roll by. The town felt smaller today, less like a cage and more like a starting block. The school gates loomed, a pair of rusted sentinels. The sixth form common room was a hive of frantic, last-minute panic. Students were huddled over textbooks, as if trying to absorb information through osmosis. Toby Jenkins was actually vibrating, his eyes fixed on a diagram of the Krebs cycle with the intensity of a man staring into the abyss. "Look at them," Clemmie whispered, leaning closer to Barnaby. "The disciples of the Mark scheme. They think the answer is in the book. They don't realize the answer is in the potato stars." "To be fair," Barnaby muttered, "the Mark scheme probably doesn't have a section for astronomy via root vegetables." The bell rang, a shrill, unforgiving sound that echoed through the corridors like a call to arms. They filed into the sports hall, a cavernous space that smelled of floor wax and old trainers. The desks were laid out in a grid, a graveyard of ambition. Barnaby found his seat. Desk 42. He looked at the clock. The second hand was ticking with a rhythmic, mocking precision. Tick. 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 You are 17. You are in a sports hall. You are supposed to explain how a plant breathes. But the plant isn't here. The plant is outside, in the rain, being a plant without any help from you. The invigilator, a man who seemed to be made entirely of beige polyester and resentment, paced the front of the room. "You may begin." The sound of 500 papers being turned at once was like the rustle of 1,000 dying dreams. Barnaby stared at the first page. Question 1. Explain the process of gaseous exchange in the alveoli. Barnaby took a breath. He thought about the air in his own lungs. He thought about the air he'd shared with Clemmie yesterday, the air that had tasted of rain and cheap chocolate. He thought about Arthur the kidney, currently languishing in his bag in a locker down the hall. He picked up his pen. His hand shook for a second, then steadied. He didn't write the textbook answer. Well, he wrote some of it, enough to satisfy the beige man in the polyester suit, but he added a little bit of his own truth. In the margins, in the tiny white spaces where the examiners tell you not to write, he drew a small, courageous squid wearing a top hat. It felt like a victory. The 2 hours passed in a blur of frantic scratching and the occasional, distant sound of someone crying quietly in the back row. When the pens down, command finally echoed through the hall, Barnaby felt a strange sense of lightness. He hadn't conquered the exam, he had simply survived it on his own terms. He met Clemmie by the lockers. She was leaning against the metal, looking entirely unbothered. "How was the performance piece?" he asked. "Luminous," she said, though she had a smudge of ink on her nose. "I think the examiner will particularly enjoy my essay on the reproductive cycle of the fern, which I interpreted as a metaphor for the British class system." "Clemmie, you'll fail." "Perhaps," she said, her eyes bright. "But I'll fail with style. And anyway, I found a fiver on the floor in the corridor. That's enough for large chips and gravy. The universe provides, Barnaby. It's a chaotic, nonsensical vending machine, but sometimes, if you kick it hard enough, it drops a Mars bar." They walked out of the school gates, leaving the frantic post-mortem of the exam behind them. The other students were arguing about question 4, their voices rising in a shrill chorus of, "Did you put osmosis? And I thought it was active transport." Barnaby and Clemmie didn't join them. They headed toward the chippy, the smell of salt and vinegar pulling them forward like a compass needle. As they sat on a low brick wall, clutching their warm, greasy parcels, the sun actually threatened to break through the clouds. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic sunset. It was just a pale, watery glow that made the puddles on the pavement shimmer. "Do you think we'll ever leave?" Barnaby asked, his mouth full of a chip that was definitely hot enough to cause third-degree burns. Clemmie looked at the horizon, at the grey roofs of Thornbury stretching out toward the motorway. "We're already gone, Barnaby," she said quietly. "In our heads, we're halfway to the coast. We're in a gallery in London. We're in a bookshop in Edinburgh. We're on a boat to somewhere that doesn't require a uniform." She reached out and patted his hand. The unstoppable was almost gone now, just a grey shadow on his skin. "The grades are just the ticket price," she continued. "If we can't afford the front row, we'll sneak in through the back door. We're good at sneaking, aren't we?" "The best," Barnaby agreed. They sat there for a long time, two 17-year-old architects of the invisible, eating chips in the dying light of a Monday afternoon. The future was still a terrifying, blank map, and the mocks were still a looming disaster, and the Great British Grey was still the national anthem of their lives. But as Barnaby looked at Clemmie, at her yellow coat, her ink-stained nose, and her unshakable belief in the significance of biscuits, he realized that he wasn't afraid of the empty spaces anymore. Life wasn't about the grades you got, or the sensible hedges you planted. It was about the people who sat on the wall with you when the chips were down. It was about the courage to draw a hat on a kidney when everyone else was drawing a diagram. It was about knowing that even if you were just a boy from a small town, with a smudged palm, and a dream of potato stars, you were part of something vast and ridiculous and beautiful. "Hey, Barnaby." "Yeah. I think we should start a cult. A very small one. Based entirely on the philosophy of the hobnob." Barnaby laughed, a genuine, chest-deep sound that startled a nearby pigeon. "What would be the first commandment?" Clemmie stood up, brushing salt from her lap, and looked at the sky. "Thou shalt not let the grey get into thy bones," she said, her voice ringing out across the quiet street. "And thou shalt always, always carry a marker pen." Barnaby stood up beside her. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of affection for the town, for the rain, for the ridiculous, beautiful struggle of being young and lost and hopeful. "Deal," he said. They walked toward the bus stop, their shadows lengthening on the pavement. The world was still demanding they become something they didn't recognize. The exams were still coming. The something was still waiting. But as the bus pulled up, its lights glowing like twin amethysts in the twilight, Barnaby Finch didn't look back. He stepped onto the platform, took his seat next to the girl in the yellow coat, and together, they rode off into the great, shimmering, unpredictable mess of the rest of their lives. And for the first time, Barnaby realized that the best stories don't have endings. They just have places where the ink runs out, and you have to find a new pen to keep writing. He reached into his bag, found his marker, and on the back of his biology textbook, in big, bold, defiant letters, he wrote,